Good evening. Welcome. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I'm Martina Droth. I'm the Deputy Director of Research and Curator of Sculpture at the Yale Center for British Art across the street. And on behalf of all of my colleagues at the center and here at the Yale University Art Gallery, I'm really delighted to welcome you to this Andrew Carnduff Ritchie program, which is a program that's co-sponsored by the two museums. And we're absolutely delighted to welcome Yinka Shonibare MBE RA to Yale. Welcome, Yinka. And it's my great pleasure to introduce both Yinka and our colleague Kobena Mercer, Professor of Art History and African American Studies here at Yale. This program coincides with a focused exhibition at the Yale Center for British Art, where we have on display 7 of Yinka Shonibare's works alongside 3 of his films, and we'll be screening the films after this talk ends. Yinka was born and educated in London, but he also spent much of his youth in Nigeria, where his parents are from. And this dual experience of 2 places, of 2 cultures, as I know many of you are very familiar with his work and that background, but that informs very much his art. He studied at Byam Shaw School of Art and then at Goldsmiths, where he did his MFA and graduated with that generation that we know as the YBAs, the Young British Artists. And it's interesting to remember that back in 1997, his work was included in Sensation, which was kind of a defining exhibition of that generation. Although maybe in this country it's best remembered for the huge political storm that engulfed it when it opened in Brooklyn. In 2002, he was commissioned to make a major work for Documenta 10, which was an important moment for his international career. And this was followed by his nomination for the Turner Prize in 2004, an exhibition at the Venice Biennale in 2007, and a string of major exhibitions all around the world have followed since. In 2011, he made his first public sculpture, Nelson's Ship in a Bottle, for the so-called 4th plinth in Trafalgar Square in London. And we have an edition of the maquette that he made for that commission on view across the street. I don't think it's exaggeration to say that this work really turns upside down pretty much everything that we might expect from or associate with public sculpture, especially in the context of the site for which this work was conceived, Trafalgar Square, this most imperial of public spaces right at the heart of London, named after the military hero Admiral Nelson and his victory at the Battle of Trafalgar. And Yinka's intervention or interruption into this space had the effect of, in a sense, unveiling or making newly and differently visible the powerful historic symbols that mark so many of our public spaces and which remain so deeply embedded in our culture that sometimes they can hide very well in plain sight. These historical themes and figures, which Yinka engages with, are precisely those that characterize our museums in many ways and our historic collections. And the center has, for a decade, longer than a decade, actively engaged in the examination of the legacies of colonialism and empire, which is so much part of the traditions of the art that we own, that we display. And our presentation of Yinka's work at the center this fall coincides very purposefully with a major exhibition curated by our former colleague Eleanor Hughes, who's now at the Walters, on 18th century marine paintings, which traces the relationship between painting traditions and Britain's rise as an imperial maritime power. And that show, which is on our 3rd floor at the center, ends with Nelson and the Battle of Trafalgar of 1805. And of course, this is where Yinka, in a sense, picks up the story in our exhibition, refracted through his lens and through the present. It's been my great pleasure to work with Yinka. His many colleagues from London are here with him, also with his gallery in New York, and especially I'd like to thank Jane Cohen for all her work on helping to develop the exhibition and this program. And our dialogue will carry forward into the spring, when we will open a new exhibition to examine the role of female royal patronage in the long 18th century, and Yinka will be creating a special piece for that show, and we're really excited to be continuing to work with him. Yinka's work is owned by many public collections, including the Smithsonian Institution, the Brooklyn Museum, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Boston MFA, the V&A. I could go on, but really I wanted to mention that we can add to that list the Yale Center for British Art, as we have acquired 2 of his works. One is a print collage, and the other is a large photographic piece from his series, The Fake Death Pictures, which relates very directly to our historic collections, in that it takes its cue from a pre-Raphaelite painting by Henry Wallace depicting the death of Chatterton, and those works are both on display at the center. So tonight is a very special opportunity to hear from Yinka and from Kobena Mercer, who is here at Yale and writes and teaches on the visual arts of the Black diaspora, examining African American, Caribbean, and Black British artists in modern and contemporary art. And Kobena was one of the earliest scholars to engage critically and analytically with what Yinka was doing. And in 1995, he published an article in Frieze magazine, which was titled Art That Is Ethnic in Inverted Commas, on Yinka Shonibare, which really for the first time addressed some of the conceptual and historical issues at work in Yinka's art. In the interim, of course, so much has been written on Yinka's work that we might take those conceptual issues more for granted now. But they were not to be taken for granted then, and more than 20 years on, Kobena's text and his continuing engagement with Yinka's work and other peers continues to provide a foundational touchstone for how we think about his art. Kobena's first book, the seminal collection Welcome to the Jungle of 1994, transformed debates and thinking around race and representation, and he has since then written many monographic studies on artists, amongst others Isaac Julian, who was here recently. He edited the Annotating Arts History series published by MIT and Innova, and he's the inaugural recipient of the 2006 Clark Prize for Excellence in Arts Writing, which was awarded by the Clark Art Institute in Williamstown. His recent book is called Travel and See, Black Diaspora Art Practices Since the 1980s, and it's just come out from Duke. Given Kobena's long-standing engagement with Yinka's work and in shaping some of the larger scholarly context around it, I'm really delighted that we have this opportunity to have both Kobena and Yinka here for this public conversation. I want to thank the many people that helped make this program happen, and our 2 guests. Please join me in welcoming them.
Okay, well, good evening, everyone. My thanks to Martina for the introduction as well. So it's a real pleasure for me to introduce Yinka Shonibare MBE to Yale and our campus community here. And our focus for our conversation this evening is the body of work that Yinka has produced, which addresses the figure of Admiral Horatio Nelson. And this includes some of the works that have been recently acquired for the collection at Yale Center for British Art. So I'm wondering if we might start at the beginning with the maquette that you produced in 2007 for your first public sculpture, which was Nelson's ship in a bottle of 2010 when it was installed in Trafalgar Square. So what we're seeing in the maquette is a miniature of the HMS Victory, and we notice straight away that the canvas sails have been rendered in Dutch wax print fabric. So what's the history of this fabric? And could you say a little bit about how you came to choose it as your signature material in your practice?
Yes. Well, first of all, I should say thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. And, I would like to share some of the ideas in my work, with you and, where all of this started. Now, I'm well known for using the fabrics in my work, known as African textiles. And indeed, I was born in London, but I grew up in Nigeria. And I grew up thinking the fabrics were made in West Africa. I realized this after I'd been at college in London. And the context of that, at the time I was actually at college, I was trained as a traditional painter. I used to do live drawing, live painting and all that. And then I think in my second year at college, I became quite political in the work that I wanted to do. And so I started making work about what was going on in Russia, and I was making work about perestroika, and I figured I was a citizen of the world and I could engage with pretty much anything, as I grew up in a cosmopolitan city like Lagos and in London. Well, to my surprise, my tutor said, well, why are you making work about Russia? What's that got to do with you? Why aren't you producing authentic African art? Now, the notion of authenticity was then the thing I started to explore. What does authenticity mean? That's a rather difficult one for somebody with my kind of background. I can't be authentically African, nor can I be authentically British. So then, what am I? I then decided to go to Brixton Market, it's a market in London, where I had actually seen the fabrics, being sold in the shops. Then I went into the shop and I started talking to them about the fabrics. And they told me, well, the fabrics actually were made in Holland. The fabrics are Indonesian-influenced fabrics produced by the Dutch. And then for sales, first they tried Indonesia. The industrial production wasn't perhaps not as attractive. So they tried West Africa, and the fabrics were successful there. But the layer of irony that I actually like, when a lot of the African countries became independent from Britain in the 50s, people actually wanted to wear non-Western clothes. So those fabrics then were adopted. But I like the paradox of something to express your own African individuality. You're then actually appropriating something then which is Western. So is the fabric then authentic or not? And so conceptually, that's the reason why I started using those fabrics.
Mm-hmm. Mm. So in relation to a battleship, which is what HMS Victory was, which enabled the British to defeat the Spanish at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, how does that history influence our understanding, the history of the fabric? How does that inflect our understanding of the event, the Battle of Trafalgar?
So in London, there is a plinth, an empty plinth in Trafalgar Square. And it's a space that's used for temporary public sculpture. And so, about, I guess, quite a number of artists are asked to send in a proposal for that plinth. And I was invited to send in a proposal. Now, Trafalgar Square is it's a very public space. Within the hour, you might have about 1 million people going through. I mean, it's a very busy point. And all around you on the square, there are kind of, generals, and there's Nelson's column. And I wanted to do something that would relate to the context of the square and the plinth. Mm. And the Nelson's column is next to the plinth. And Trafalgar Square, I then researched, Trafalgar, the Battle of Trafalgar happened in 1805, and Nelson had a battle with Napoleon. And anyway, Nelson won that battle, the British won, and then the British were able to actually have freedom of the seas. If Napoleon had lost that battle, I'd probably be speaking to you guys in French now. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Just saying. Yes. So where were we? And then I wanted to actually put HMS Victory, the flagship of Nelson, into a giant bottle. I'm doing two things here. Usually, within the public realm, public sculpture tends to be quite serious, at Trafalgar Square anyway. I wanted something that would be serious and playful at the same time. Something that the public can actually engage with, but then would actually explore issues around colonialism and also particularly multicultural London. London looks the way it looks now in terms of its population because of those, British adventures in the past. But the interesting thing about this space is people who are very nationalistic actually thought I was celebrating Nelson. And people who are kind of anti-nationalistic thought, good on you, really subversive piece. But I like that. I like that, people not quite knowing what the piece is doing. Yeah.
And we'll look at the piece itself in a moment, but perhaps one last question in terms of your thinking when you produced the maquette. So what led you to the ship in a bottle? We have impossible bottles in which many ordinary objects are placed inside a glass container. And it's something that has a nautical origin, something that's produced in a sort of, that sailors would have produced at the end of the 18th century. I'm sure it's a question that's come up many times before, but even at the maquette stage, how did you get the ship inside the bottle?
I think that I'd have to kill you if I told you.
Okay, right. Well, perhaps we'll move on to the next question.
Right. Yes.
Okay, that's obviously a trade secret.
Yes.
You've mentioned a little bit about the fourth plinth, which when Sir Edwin Landseer created the bronze lions to act as guardians for Nelson's column in the 1870s, the fourth one remained empty. But it's only really been in the last 15 years that it's become a site for public art. So can you walk us through the commissioning process? What was it like after you were invited? Because after all, this was officially commissioned by the Mayor of London, Boris Johnson.
Yes.
What was the response of the commissioning group to your proposal?
Well, I mean, I presented my proposal very well. I had the maquette of the ship in a bottle, and it was, very well made. And I was, in fact, told that they were actually impressed by my presentation. And it was just purely on the presentation, it was unanimous. They were very excited about it. But for me, it was a very scary process because when it starts off as a competition. So you get a short list of about 4, and then they display the 4 maquettes. And then the public get to vote. I think the public has got just 1 vote, and the committee have, the rest. And when I saw the names on the list, I had no experience of public sculpture at this time. So I saw, Anthony Gormley, Anish Kapoor, and I thought, well, that's it. I'm not getting it. But anyway, I did get through. And so, I was,
But there was no pushback in the process in terms of no concerns being voiced on the part of the commissioning?
Well, no, I mean, everybody said, of course you can't make that. It's a huge, I think my voice is going, I need to drink something.
Get some water.
Excuse me. Okay, I'll tell you when I have it. Don't drop. Wait, yeah, that's it. Talk amongst yourselves. Yeah. Can you put that up? Yeah. Okay, yeah.
So I wonder whether the response, because it was so favourable, has something to do with the British having a very patriotic relationship to their ships. I mean, when the Ark Royal, which played a part in the Falklands War, was decommissioned, people lined the streets. But interesting thing is that HMS Victory has never been decommissioned.
No, there's a captain. I mean, I actually went to see it, you know, and the captain of the ship actually came down to Trafalgar Square to see the piece.
And what was his response?
Well, no, he absolutely loved it. You know, he wanted his photograph taken with me and everything. Yeah.
So we can see the way in which the bottle relates to the column, perhaps a little bit in this installation view. You've put your ship in a bottle and the column into a conversation. You mentioned previously, just now, that it was important to open up a conversation. But what principle are you acting on in terms of not choosing to make a statement, but rather trying to sort of call forth a conversation?
And what do you mean?
How did you avoid the temptation of making a statement?
Well, I mean, first of all, public sculpture, in terms of this kind of national spaces like Trafalgar Square, you know, traditionally the sculpture there would be rather didactic, and it's sometimes even jingoistic, you know, very militaristic and very, as an artist, I'm not didactic, I don't, you know, and also we do need to put this actually very much in the context of post-structuralism, and in the context of a lot of the kind of French theory that I kind of grew up with. Now, what I mean about that is there is a process, and you know we'll talk about that later as well. But there's a process of challenging the grand narratives. You know, people of my generation. Actually, what I mean by this is looking at history and looking at my own position as somebody of African origin against, you know, Western history, and then saying, actually, we do need to start unraveling all of this. And so the reason I actually go into this, or I go into the kind of theory aspect of this, is it's actually, you know, my own background has kind of informed my approach to grand narratives, so that something which is all the authoritarian spaces, you know, like Trafalgar Square, I want to actually play about in it, in that space. I don't, you know, I can't actually produce something didactic in that space, you know, because so in other words, my generation, we grew up really challenging all those ideologies. You know, that's what and we want to represent, or we want to represent, quote unquote, the other. But we don't want to do that in a kind of didactic manner.
Right.
So then that piece is the opposite, you know, it is the opposite of public sculpture in that sense.
So that's really interesting. It's an aesthetic principle of deconstruction
Yes.
that you're acting on.
Yes.
Almost like evoking the iconography of power to subvert power.
Absolutely, yes.
And in formal terms, rather than theoretically, though, how much consideration did you give to scale? Because in a sense, you've supersized a miniature, the ship in the bottle, as a source object.
Yes.
So that it's almost in conversation with this monumental public sculpture, which is Nelson's column. But so you're playing around, that playful element comes in terms of scale. Were you thinking of that at the maquette stage as well?
Oh, no, absolutely, yes. It's making something which is small, grand. You know, it's kind of trying to find grandeur in the playful. You know, so it's something which is kind of playful, seems grand. But then it's actually, you know, the grandiose is usually intimidating. But in this space, it isn't. I mean, it's playful.
And are there sculptors that have been inspirational to you in terms of playing with scale, playing with the grandiose in a way that deflates the monumental? I'm thinking perhaps of Claes Oldenburg.
Well, no, absolutely. I mean, you know, Claes Oldenburg is important. But you see, the difference between this work and Claes Oldenburg's work is, well, first of all, this work is site-specific. And also, I think it's a work which is historically loaded in a different way. Now, I'm not suggesting that Claes Oldenburg's work, in its subversiveness, it is historic, it is challenging something else. But this, you know, the narrative, there's a narrative which is actually embedded in this work, and that narrative is linked to identity. Do you see? So, yeah. So it's playful and yet dark.
Absolutely.
But with Claes Oldenburg, I don't see the darkness in it. Yeah.
And following on from that then, I mean, it's pointed as well as being playful.
Yes.
Would you be comfortable if that strategy that you've employed in this work was described as historically revisionist? Would that be an adequate description, or would you be uncomfortable with thinking of your work here as being a revisionist account of the Battle of Trafalgar?
In what sense do you mean that? Do you mean that do you mean nostalgic, or do you mean nostalgic?
No, revisionist history often wants to challenge a grand narrative by saying that something's been left out, or there's another point of view.
Oh, no, it would not be revisionist in that sense, because actually, I'm often complicit.
Okay.
So complicity is actually central to my practice.
Can you say a bit more about that? How did it become central?
I don't know if I want to be part of the establishment or if I want to knock it down. So there is a secret, in other words, there is a secret celebration of the things that I subvert. It's, you know, the world is often binary in its thinking. You know, you're either with us or against us. But I don't actually subscribe to that. So that's what I mean, that there's actually a degree of complicity in the things that I do. You know, it's not something that some people find easy to understand. But, you know, I mean, I thought I was really subversive until I went to Buckingham Palace, and I liked being there.
Okay. Right.
You know, so, I mean...
So that emphasizes the element of irony that has always been the way that you've approached being playful in this very pointed way without losing sight of that darker history that's behind
No, absolutely,
public
yes.
spaces, public institutions.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's horrific. You know, some of those legacies are absolutely horrific, you know. But at the same time, I do not wish to be perennially on the margins.
Indeed, and I think that what the strategy of breaking through the binaries to achieve something that is hybrid, which is, I think, written into the fabric itself,
Yes.
is something that is future-oriented. It's about what is Britain going to become next? It's not just focused, not dwelling on the past exclusively.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. So perhaps let's move on to Nelson's jacket and Fanny's dress, in the sense that you then focused in on the intimate relationship between Horatio Nelson and Frances Woolwood, who was actually born on the Caribbean island of Nevis. And it's in the Caribbean context of Nelson's service in the West Indies. He was stationed at Barbados at one point, that they were matched and married.
Yes.
What led to your interest in their relationship, as opposed to where we started with, which is Nelson as the national hero? What led you then on to look at the relationship between Francis and Horatio?
Well, so as after often my projects tend to, if you like, give birth to new thoughts or new ideas. You know, one project will lead on to another thing. So while I was researching Nelson's Ship in a Bottle, then I did more research on Nelson, and then I found that Nelson was indeed a very, very naughty boy. You know, so he, you know, his affair with his mistress was absolutely scandalous. And, you know, he was married. And in 7 years, you know, for those 7 years, he saw his wife for 7 months of those 7 years. And then he, you know, he was in love with Emma, Emma, Lady Hamilton. And so that, and at the time, that was absolutely scandalous. And she was, you know, a very, very attractive woman. And she was also impressed by, you know, the fact he'd won this battle. You know, he won some other battles before he finally died, you know, in 1805 at the Battle of Trafalgar. So I looked at that relationship, and then at the same time, I wanted to overlap that story with Traviata, which is Verdi's opera. So it's kind of, you know, overlapping two stories, one fictional and one real. Again, Traviata is about two lovers, but I liked the kind of tragic nature of the opera and the tragic nature of Nelson's life. So, and also, in that tragedy, I saw a metaphor for the decline and fall of the empire. And that's why I made that piece.
And we'll come on with a clip from that in a moment. But could you walk us through the research process that led you to recreate in such meticulous craftsmanship these period costumes? How do you go about selecting the Dutch wax print fabric that you choose? What was the process in each of these pieces?
I mean, I have worked, you know, in my studio with a number of costumiers over the years, you know, depending on the projects that I want to do. And I do have costume books in my studio. So, I mean, obviously I don't sew. I can't sew. But I do design things, you know, and I designed this dress, and I select the patterns and the shapes that I want. And then, and I wanted to create, you know, Nelson's jacket. I mean, there is a jacket. The original one is actually at the Maritime Museum in Greenwich, in London. And in fact, the Ship in the Bottle is now outside the Maritime Museum permanently because they acquired it after the Trafalgar Square. But in relation to the costumes, it's a process of just choosing the colors I want. I mean, there are a lot of formal decisions being made, you know, in terms of color, shape, and so on. And I think I possibly design in the way that a painter would design. I mean, a lot of it is very visual. Yes, that's, I think, yeah.
Because in Nelson's jacket, we can see the chains that clearly have a naval connotation.
Yes.
But in some of the other fabrics, we see logos like the Chanel logo, the Mercedes-Benz logo, even the pound sterling sign. And these are incorporated into fabrics produced by Bliss Co in the Netherlands, and so on. That suggests both something that's alluring. It's a Bliss Co fabric is a high-end luxury product in many West African, Central African markets. But is there another layer of irony that you're building by transposing them with such accuracy to these period costumes?
Well, I mean, it's, you know, that surrealist thing of the umbrella and the sewing machine and the, you know, do you know what I mean by that? You know, the kind of mixing of things, or you know, and so there's that kind of quirky sort of surrealist thing as well that goes on, where I would pick something that's not meant to go together, or might see, you know, a pattern and an overlap with something else to create a third meaning and so on, you know. So there kind of, you know, sort of some private games going on with the kind of fabrics and the images I choose, you know, because after all, it's got to be fun, you know, you want to make, you know. So, and it's an enjoyable process, you know, my work, you know, and so there's a lot of kind of playful things going on when I juxtapose things.
I'm wondering whether there's also another dimension in that fabric acts as a kind of masquerade, that with costumes and appearance and the way that people can manipulate their appearance, as they did in the 18th century.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
They can move beyond the social station that they were born into. Is that something in the back of your mind when you're recreating these period costumes?
Well, yes, I mean, indeed, you know, and as you well know, Carnival in the Caribbean, you know, that was a day in which, you know, the slaves could be the aristocrats for a day, and the aristocrats could be whatever they wanted to be. But it was, and, you know, Carnival is a way. So there's a process of transformation, you know, and costume or dress is a way in which you can become something else for a day, at least, you know, yeah.
And the way in which they're placed in vitrines with the headless mannequins draws attention to the theatricality of dress as a kind of performance. Do you see a correlation with our celebrity culture today? You mentioned, you know, this affair of Nelson's that made him a celebrity in contemporary eyes. Were you drawing our attention to something similar that's taking place in the present?
Well, I mean, all of my work, even when it appears historical, is about the present. You know, it's always about, you know, I'm always sort of going back to history to find metaphors for the present. You know, the present is too present, if you see what I mean, to actually, you know, it will come across, you know, if I suddenly had, you know, Kim Kardashian all over my work, you know, that would be too present. You know, so, you know, I would have to have other metaphors. Yeah.
So the juxtaposition allows both distance, that there's a historical dimension to it, and also a commentary on the present that's indirect, that takes place indirectly. So moving on to the film, and we have a clip coming up after I've just perhaps ask a question to set the scene. This is a film, you mentioned Verdi's La Traviata of 1859 as well, but what was it that attracted you to the medium of film and the moving image that you couldn't have explored in an installation or sculpturally?
I think there is something about performance within cinema and within the moving image, and also the transformation of the idea of time within film. You know, you can't do things with time that you cannot do in something which is static. You know, and I like that, and I like the, yes, I just like what you can do with time within cinema.
Okay. Well, let's run the clip. We have a brief clip from it, and then follow that up.
And sound, of course.
Yeah.
Sound is important.
Okay. So that was just a brief extract.
Yeah.
But you've taken up Francis's point of view. So I want to know why your empathy, why your sympathies were with Frances. She's in the role of Violette from Verdi's opera, who's expressing loss on the eve of her death in the opera. But we see the unopened letters that Horatio Nelson returned to Frances. What led you to think of the film from Francis's point of view?
Well, again, on this occasion, I decided not to be on the side of patriarchy. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I decided that, you know, the oppressive nature of patriarchy in terms of imperialism and misogyny was not something I wanted to support.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. So that was one institution of power that you didn't feel comfortable
Yes,
in.
I did not.
Right, okay. And was it the aesthetic qualities of the opera rather than the story that attracted you to that aria?
I think both. I also think that at the time of doing it, I was really contemplating literally the end of empire. Both the end of the American empire, the end of the British Empire, and we're in a kind of a strange situation now where there are other forces wanting to take that position. Be it Russia, be it China, but there is something going on. And so, and this is a film, a metaphor for exploring those in a way. Because you do see the film is constantly interrupted by the death of Nelson. There is one point where he's jumping off a mountain and stabbing himself at the same time. So there is this. So it's my way of contemplating those things, but doing it through the cinema. So you could say that she took the lead role because I was exploring, if you like, the death of patriarchy. But, patriarchy then being a metaphor for the death of imperial powers or the death of imperialism. Yeah.
So as an allegory of loss or impending loss, it's important that it was embodied in a female voice.
Yes, yeah.
And there's repetition that's involved, and you talked a little bit about your interest in time.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
That led to your work in film. Because repetition also features in A Masked Ball, which focuses on the assassination of King Gustav III of Sweden at the end of the 18th century.
Yes.
So were there filmmakers or film practices that were influential for you in terms of thinking about a cyclical rather than narrative time structure?
Yes. There's a film called The Last Days at, because I'm thinking there's some Godard films where things are constantly repeated. French New Wave cinema. And so, but you see, the repetition in my films are based on a kind of, it's based on mimicry of the loop. So what I mean by that is, when you go into a gallery, a video is playing over and over again. It's on a loop. But it's the same thing that just plays over and over again. But what I wanted to do with this video is to have the actors actually reenact something again. But when you go in, you think, oh, it's on a loop. But when you look closely, you realize that, no, actually, it's not on a loop. They're actually doing the same thing again. But that's kind of strange because the actors can never do the same act twice. So there's always a slight difference. So it's almost like it's a modernist strategy where the form, the process becomes the art. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? Yeah.
And the repetition heightens one's appreciation of these subtle variations in each iteration.
Yeah.
But moving on to a sort of parallel work from an earlier period, the late 1990s. But this again is focused on that turning point from the era of Enlightenment, the French and American revolutions, Trafalgar, into the 19th century. But you're not only challenging national histories of British maritime history, but art history as well. So what were some of the decisions in the back of your mind that led to the marriage portrait by Thomas Gainsborough that you're referencing in this sculpture of 1998?
Well, you're looking at Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, painted by Gainsborough. And my version is Mr. and Mrs. Andrews without their heads. At the time, I was actually very interested in the French Revolution. and I was also, I showed a strong interest in the guillotine. And I felt that, I would apply the guillotine to history. And so Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, without their heads, the newlywed couple, and you can see their estate in the background, and how did they make their money, who was slaving away so they could have all that. So I took their estate away and I chopped their heads off. Simple, So that's what you see in the piece.
It is indeed simple, but also very striking in the sense that, is there a comment as well about the emphasis on reason and rationality in the Enlightenment?
Well, I mean, the Enlightenment is being a lie, in a way. I mean, I'm sitting here speaking to you in English because of the Enlightenment. I'd rather be speaking to you in Yoruba. But I can't do that. I'm not allowed. Well, I'm allowed to do that, but it's complicated. Yes, and it's a little protest. It's just like a little protest. This works, and it's a way of saying, actually, perhaps we ought to value other traditions as well. Or perhaps we ought to, perhaps we should not have the dominance of the West in the same way, because the Enlightenment is being used as an excuse to wipe out whole cultures and whole traditions, and not seeing value in other traditions. And so I can, challenge those things through my work.
So something which proclaimed the supremacy of reason was actually using unreasonable force and violence.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. What did the Enlightenment produce? Nuclear weapons and guns.
No, and again, it's bringing out that, in a very pointed way, that dark side of modern history, making it available for discussion without being didactic or without closing down the narrative.
No, absolutely, yes.
But as we come towards a conclusion with the fake death pictures, the photo
Yes.
works, we're looking at something here which references the death of Chatterton, the Romantic
Yes.
poet,
Yes.
by the pre-Raphaelite painter,
Yes.
Wallace. Are you commenting also on the romanticization of death?
Well, also the romanticization of Nelson's death in particular. There were all kinds of myths surrounding his death. And Nelson is a kind of a figure, almost like elevated to a mythological figure, in a way, mythological status. And I wanted to, I've deliberately called those fake death pictures because I was also interested in the mythology or the kind of romantic idea about somebody's death. That person could have been the nastiest person when they were alive, but there's a kind of the way that we kind of romanticize their death, and the whole myth around Nelson's death is also around that. He was a hero, but he was a flawed hero. But that's not the bits that that we like to emphasize or talk about.
And there's a close relationship between photography and painting here, in that
Yes.
photography is a medium valued for its veracity, its truth to lifeness. What you're emphasizing, though, is something that's contrary to that, which is, and we can see it in the photo work that references Manet's suicide of 1877, it's the theatricality, the fakery, the artifice.
Yes, yeah.
Could you say more about what photography allows you to do as a medium?
Well, I think it's the tableau. The tableau, nature of photography. You can it's theatrical and it's staged. You can stage something and you can light it in a way that you want. So you can, and it's the kind of, tableau effect that I feel I can achieve with photography. And also, we don't usually pen those kinds of pictures now, but we can stage them. But then this is also an extension. There's a correlation anyway between still photography like this and cinema as well. So, and I'd often will photograph a location if I want to make a film, and I would do my storyboards using photography to stage something. And actually, the photography came first, and then it seemed like a logical progression of the photography to actually do film. Yeah.
And how were you led to this work by a lenser, which is, it's a portrait of death twice removed, in the sense that it's a satire of the
Yes.
the romanticization of death.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think obviously it's kind of me, kind of also mocking myself and mocking, you set something up, but then you cancel what you set up as well. Yeah, it's kind of not taking yourself too seriously, but also it's funny. I mean, and it's absolutely ridiculous.
Well, sort of coming full circle as we come to an end, you did mention earlier on that a permanent home has been found for Nelson's ship in a bottle at the National Maritime Museum, which is in a very historically rich site. It's a World Heritage Site.
Yeah.
And today, there's a lot, I mean, I want to ask you a question about the ethics of public art, because it's come under a great deal of scrutiny today. And there are those who argue that sculptures that glorify the imperial past or past histories of slavery should simply be removed. You're offering an alternative, but what's your view on that firmly held view by some that we should now dispense with these reminders of that dark history?
Well, I don't think that we should be removing things we don't like. I think that I wouldn't go into a library and take out all the bad books just because I don't like it. I think that a lot of the very painful historical images of slavery and so on, I think they should become tools of education. I think that we should, if we removed all these things, we risk actually repeating those things. And I don't think that it's appropriate to erase the bits of history that you happen not to like. And clearly, the people who advocate the removal of these things probably wouldn't support going into libraries and taking out all the bad books. Well, there might be an argument that the books are not as visible on a daily basis, but I still believe that to remove those things would be to erase history, therefore to risk a repetition of those grotesque events.
So the irony and the playfulness that you've evoked previously as an indispensable aspect of your aesthetic strategy is really ethically and politically conceptualized as well. It enables us to talk about these painful histories.
Absolutely. I mean, I want people to explore the history of the Battle of Trafalgar through the ship in a bottle, and through the past, we understand our today. If we were to erase the past, how then do we understand our today?
Right.
Yeah.
So let's end on a question about tomorrow, in the sense that I know, can you share with us a little bit about the commission that you recently received from the National Museum of African American History and Culture? And does it relate
No,
to...
the Smithsonian Museum of African
Oh,
Art.
my mistake, sorry.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that commission?
Yes, so after doing the ship in a bottle, the process of working on the sales generated new ideas for public sculpture, and they are more playful. They're called wind sculptures, and they're made of fiberglass, and they're painted fiberglass with steel armatures in the middle of them. And so I have the wind sculptures are over 5 meters tall, and I have them. There's one on permanent display in London near Victoria Station, a place called Hawick Place, and so one of the wind sculptures will be on permanent display outside the Smithsonian Museum of African Art. So that's the commission that you're talking about. Yeah.
Well, allow me to express congratulations for that, and also to say that we have an opportunity to ask individual questions to Yinka at the reception that's taking place over the road at the Yale Centre for British Art. But for now, please join me in thanking Yinka Shonibare.